everyone, how's it going today? On today's tutorial we are going to be looking at ON1 Photo Raw. Specifically we'll be looking at the lens blur filter. We're going to be taking this image right here and changing it into this image. So what we're going to be doing is creating a shallow depth of field effect, simulating maybe like a 1.8 aperture lens. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is prepare our image. Now remember, what I'm doing here is using ON1 Photo Raw 2018 as a plugin inside of Photoshop. So we're going to leave Photoshop, go into ON1, and then do our adjustments and then come back into Photoshop. So the first thing we want to do is work non-destructively. And to do that, we want to duplicate our background layer. So we're going to click on our background layer, type Command J on a Mac, Control J on a PC to duplicate the background layer. That's very important. Next thing I want to do is this little white little thing right here. I don't like it, so I'm going to get rid of it. So what I'm going to do is, I like to work non-destructively, so what I'll do is add a blank layer on top of that layer. You can type J on a Mac or a PC, I believe, and you'll get the healing brush. You can come up and just click the healing brush right here. And then basically what we want to do is just paint over that little area right there and get rid of that. Just like that, it's gone. The next thing we want to do is right-click on Layer 2 and select Merge Down, give that a click. That'll merge those two layers together. Now we can go ahead and launch ON1 Photo Raw. So we come up to the menu and click on Filter, and then come down to ON1, and then select ON1 Effects 2018, give that a click, and we will load up ON1 Photo Raw. Now what we want to do is go over to the right side of the interface and click Add Filter. When I do that, you'll notice we have this whole list of filters here. There's 24 filters inside of ON1 Photo Raw. And we're going to be looking at each and every one of these filters. I'm going to take one video per filter so we can really dive into these filters and get an understanding of how they work. But today we're working with lens blur. Okay, so let's just click on lens blur, and that opens up the lens blur filter dialog. Now let's take a look and see what we have here. At the top of this dialog, we have the opacity slider. So if we take that opacity slider, we can take it and move it to the left and pull back the opacity of the effect. Every one of the filters, I believe, have this opacity adjustment on them. So that's pretty cool. So we can make some adjustments there. I typically, however, don't use that too often unless I'm stacking up filters in here, and sometimes I'll do that, but a lot of times I'm only working with one filter at a time. And so I'll use the opacity slider inside of Photoshop to make those final adjustments. But for now, let's leave the opacity 100%. Then we have here a list of presets. ON1 likes to call these styles. I call them presets. Same thing. But we have tilt shift, which will give us a tilt shift effect. Let's give that a click and you'll see it. Sides. Okay, we have a different effect. The blur is on the sides of the image. Round. The blur is rounded out all around the image here, kind of like a vignette. Then if you click on more over here, we have different presets as well, or styles. And we can hover over these and see the effects change. There's bokeh large, medium, bokeh shapes, then we have bokeh small, round, side, softly vignette, starry night, tilt shift. Okay, so let me just click that off. Before we get into the actual adjustments of this lens blur filter, I want to explain something very important. See this little layer mask icon right here? Very important. This particular filter relies heavily upon layer masking, and that's how the effects are achieved by using layer masking, applying blur to the image and masking off areas where you don't want the blur to be applied to, and that's how it works. So let's click on this little layer mask icon, and when we do, we open up this layer masking dialog here, and we see there's a layer mask here. We see an invert button, a luminosity button, a reset button, a view button. I'm going to click the view button. You'll see the layer mask on the screen. You'll notice the black area. Whenever you see a black area in a layer mask like this, that means that the effect will not show through. Whenever you see a white area on a layer mask, the effect will show through. Now let's click view again so we can see the image. And you notice in the center, we don't see the effect added. On the edges, we do. So that's important to understand how that works. So let's go ahead and reset our layer mask. So let's click this reset button right here. And when we do, this layer mask goes to white, and now you'll notice that there is blur over the entire image. Now let's give ourselves a little bit more real estate, and then I'm going to go into these sliders here. So let's click the layer mask icon, give it a click, and now we got rid of that layer masking dialog, and now we can just hone in on these adjustments here. Okay, let's start looking at the sliders here. Now let's look at the amount slider first. If I take the amount slider and move it to the left, I will take the effect off. If I move it to the right, the blur will increase and get more and more and more and more. So there's a lot of latitude here for the actual blur itself. The optic quality simulates the quality of the lens. If I move it to the right, it gets a more creamier bokeh look. If I move it to the left, it gets a little like lower quality looking. Look at these little bokeh bubbles down here. You can see they don't look quite as creamy and smooth. You see this like circle right here. It's like open and center. And watch that when I move the optic quality to the right. Notice how that circle kind of closes up. The image looks a lot creamier. Okay, so let's leave the optic quality down for now. All right, now let's look at this section where it says Aperture. And underneath Aperture, you see sides, curvature, blooming, brightness, contrast, and noise. Let's start off with curvature and look at this particular bokeh bubble right here. There's a bunch of bokeh bubbles on the actual image, but let's hone in on this one. I'm going to take this curvature and move it to the right, and watch that bokeh bubble shape change a little bit. See, it's more circular now. I'm going to move it to the left, and you'll see its shape is actually changing. Okay, I'm going the whole way to the left now. Now the sides slider, it simulates the sides of your actual aperture ring inside your camera. I'm going to move it to the right. It'll show more sides. Now I'm going to move it to the left. And watch the shape change and morph as I move it to the left. It's kind of pretty cool. And watch around here too. See like the CA on there? Watch how the shapes change on that too. So you can be creative with these shapes. But here it looks like a star almost. There's another different shape, like a diamond shape. Okay, like a triangle there. So those shapes will morph and change. So you can use these for creative effects when you're making your images. The blooming will, wherever you see these shapes, the blooming will make those shapes brighter if you move it to the right, and less bright as you move it to the left. Okay, and then the brightness will actually adjust the overall brightness of the actual blur in your image. The sections of the image that do not have blur will not get brighter. And I'll demonstrate that later when I start actually putting the effect on the image that I want. And the contrast will actually increase the contrast of the blur, but only the blur, and decrease the contrast of the blur. And lastly, let's take a look at this noise slider right here. And what this noise slider does is it adds simulated film grain to match the structure of the blurred region to the sharp region. This is very, very important. No matter what piece of software that you are going to use, be it Photoshop to add blur, be it Photo Raw 2018, ON1's Photo Raw 2018 to add blur to your image. Whenever you add blur to an image, you will totally obliterate any noise that was in that image. That's not necessarily a good thing, because even though you've used noise reduction software on your images, you will still always see a little bit of noise in your image, okay? And so whenever you add blur to the image, you need to add a little bit of noise to match the noise that's in the non-blurred areas of the image. And that's what this noise slider does. And I'll show you how we do that in a minute or two here. But right now, let's take this noise slider and bump it the whole way up to the right. And you see the noise that has been added to the overall image, because right now the whole image has blur on it. Then when I move it to the left, I can decrease that amount of noise to just the level that I would want to put it in the image. For now, let's just shut it off. Okay, now let's get into the actual adjustment that I want to make on this image. Let's start out by taking this optic quality and let's move it up to the right. I want to get a nice creamy bokeh in this image. I'm not worried too much about bokeh bubbles and shapes in this image. I just want to simulate a nice shallow depth of field. So I'm just going to take this optic quality the whole way up to the right, give myself a nice creamy blur. And you can see I have a nice creamy blur over the entire image. There's one more adjustment I want to make before I get started here, and that is to take this curvature adjustment and move it to the right, because I noticed there's a little star shape down here, some type of a shape, and I don't really want that in there. I want more of a soft circle. So I'm going to move this curvature to the right, and you can see that turns more circular. However, this part of the image is not going to be blurred anyway, so not a big deal, but the rest of the image just looks overall, the blur looks pretty nice on it. Now we're ready to mask our image to get that shallow depth of field look. So let's go over to the left side of the interface here. And you'll notice here we have a bunch of different tools, crop tools, different masking brush tools. We have a masking bug tool, which we're going to be using right now. So let's just give that a click, the masking bug tool. And then come over to the center of the screen, give it another click. Okay, and we'll see a masking bug overlay here. And right now we're seeing the gradient overlay. And if you look up at the top here, where it says shape, right now it's on gradient. If I give this drop down a click, we'll see there's a center shape, there's an edges shape, a gradient shape, which we just saw, a reflected gradient. And to the left up here, we have presets. Let me click that drop down. We have vignette, strong, linear top, linear bottom, linear left, and linear right. We're not going to look at those today, but right now we're going to look at the shapes. So we're going to study each and every one of them. So let's go to the first shape, center. Give that a click. And then when I bring my cursor down to the canvas, we will see the masking bug overlay on the screen. This center circle right here enables you to move the masking bug all around to any position you want. The other circle here, the smaller circle, lets you adjust the angle of the masking bug. Pretty cool, right? And then you have these 4 circles, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And these circles let you adjust the shape of the masking bug, which I can move the shape in, pull it out. I can go up to the top one, pull the shape down, make it more oval, bring it up. Take the shape on the left, move it in, move it out, bottom shape, move it up, move it down. Now, if you'll notice here, the center section right now, when we're using the center shape, the center section has no effect applied to it, so there's no blur applied to it. The outer edges have a blur applied. And if you look over here at our layer mask, and let me give that a click, you can actually see when I click on view here, you can actually see the layer mask. So you see the black area, there is no effect applied in the white areas where the blur effect is applied. So if we click view again, we'll go back to the screen. And let's click on our masking bug again so we can see it. So here's our masking bug. So if you'll notice here, right at this line right here, from this line here, and then if we follow it up to this dash line here, so the blur starts here and it graduates up to it hits this dash line, then it goes full on blur. Okay, and so that is the center. Now let's examine another shape. Let's go to the edges shape. Now the edges shape is the opposite of the center. We have the blur in the center and we have the edges having no effect. And as we can see, let's click on the view button again and we can see. So the center with a white area is getting full blur. The outer edges is black, meaning getting no effect. Let's click view on again. So that is the edges. And again, we can move this around. We can adjust its angle. We can adjust the shape and so on. Let's look at another one. Let's look at the gradient. Okay, the gradient. Again, we can move it up or down. We can adjust the angle. Now, on this one, see the dash line here and the dash line here. This is the gradient field right in here. So in other words, the blur starts here and gradually increases till it hits this dash line, and then it goes to full blur. And now we can expand this blur field too. If we take this dash line here and we pull it up, notice how that graduated area right in here is spreading apart. So we can make all kind of cool adjustments there. Get it just the way we like it. Again, we can move it up and down and so forth. So that's cool. That's the gradient. The one we're going to be using today will be the reflected gradient. Let's give that one a click. This one's really cool. And the way this one works is there's no effect applied to the center of this reflected gradient, and then at this line the blur will start and gradually build up till it hits the dash line and then full on blur. And on this end of it, the blur starts here and gradually fills up till it hits here and then full on blur. And now let's click the view button here so we can see. So in the black area, no blur, and then here is blur here and blur here. Let's click view again to get our image back. Let's make sure we have our masking bug selected. Let's give that a click. And now what we want to do is rotate this masking bug. So I'm going to rotate it like this. What I'm trying to do is have this dashed line be parallel with one of these fence post lines. So I'm just going to give that a slight adjustment till that looks pretty parallel. And I think right there looks pretty good. Now this line right here, again, like I told you, from this line over to this line is no effect added. So I'm going to take this line and move it to the left of my model a little bit to maybe right about here. I'm going to take this right line and move it to the right. So I'm just going past my model's arm, maybe somewhere right around there. On this side, what I'm going to do is take this transitional line, give it a drag, and make that transition longer and wider and wider and wider and wider. And then I'm going to take this line over here and just move it a little bit more. So I just want a very little blur here. Again, I'm trying to simulate a shallow depth of field. And then this transitional line, I want the blur to start here but get increasingly more and more and more till it comes over here to like a full-on blur. So let's take this transitional line and move it over, say, somewhere in here. So I want the blur to start here and get gradually more and more and more and more. Okay, so once I got that set, then we can come over to the interface and start making adjustments. Let's click on our layer mask icon right here and actually see what and click the view button and see what our layer mask looks like. So as you can see here, I have very little blur on this side, and on the left side I have a lot of blur starting here and working its way over. So let's click view again, click on our layer mask icon to hide the layer mask properties. Okay, so now let's take the amount slider, let's move it to the right and get just the right touch of blur for this image. So I'm thinking that looks very unnatural there. So again, I'm trying to simulate like a 1.8 aperture lens, and I'm thinking I want a nice amount of bokeh, but I'm thinking maybe somewhere right about there. And this looks real natural over here. Okay, so that looks good. So my model is just no blur on him whatsoever and a nice natural blur coming over this way and just a little bit of blur here. Now, what I want to do is press Command plus on a Mac to zoom into 100%, and that would be Control plus on a PC to zoom into 100%. Press and hold the spacebar while clicking and dragging your mouse to the right, ending up on the area we wish to take a closer look at. Then release the mouse click and also release the spacebar. What we want to do here is match the grain structure from the non-blur area to the blur area. Now the blur area has no grain whatsoever. Like I said, whenever you apply a blur to an image, you totally obliterate the grain. There's not much noise in this image here, so there's not much we have to do here. But let me show you how this noise slider works. I'm going to pull this noise slider the whole way to the right. And when I do, you'll notice we got a lot of grain to the left where the heavy blur is, and it minimizes itself as it comes to the right. It gets less and less and less, which is really cool. This does a really good job of simulating the noise into the blur area. So that gives you a really believable image. Okay, so I love that. Thank you, ON1. So in our case, let's back this noise off to make it look very natural. And I'm going to take it almost the whole way off. I'm just going to add a little bit of noise to the image right there. Now, if we press Command and 0 on a Mac, Control and 0 on a PC, will come back to full screen. And there we go, guys. Let's click our preview button. Here is the before and here is the after. A very believable blurring effect. Simulating a shallow 1.8 roughly lens. Pretty cool. I don't have a lot of bokeh shapes being displayed on my canvas right now. So these other sliders here, sides, curvature, blooming, I'm not going to really mess with them because not a lot happening in the bokeh, so I don't have to worry about that. If I had a lot of bokeh shapes happening over here, I would play with these sliders, but at this point I don't really need to. What I did want to show you is the brightness. This is really nice. If I take the brightness up to the right, notice it only adjusts the brightness in the areas of bokeh. My model is not being touched, which is really cool. If I move the brightness to the left, I can darken down the blurry sides of the image, which acts sort of like a vignetting type effect on the edges. So that's pretty cool. So let me just bring that down a little bit on the brightness side to about a -9. Now the contrast, if I move the contrast to the right, it's only going to affect the blurred areas of the image. And you notice that the blurred areas of the image are taking on some contrast. And also note, when I pull that contrast up, you will notice a lot more saturation gets induced into the image. That always happens whenever you take a contrast control and drag it to the right, add more contrast to an image. It tends to add increased saturation into your image. So bear that in mind. So you got to be careful there. There's things we can do to take care of that. We can use blending modes. ON1 has blending modes. Photoshop has blending modes. We can set the blending mode to say luminosity and get rid of that. But in my case, I'm not going to really increase the contrast. I'm going to actually decrease it. So that won't be an issue. So I'm going to come back to 0. And then I'm just going to move a little bit to the left of 0, take a little bit of that contrast out. So I just wanted to show you that one final adjustment, the brightness and contrast. And when we're all said and done, all we have to do is come down to Done, give that a click, and that brings us right back into Photoshop. One final note. On this layer that we just brought back into Photoshop, which is labeled Layer 1, and let's click the eyeball so we can see the before and the after. Pretty cool effect, right? We added that nice shallow depth of field. Now, one note, the opacity slider. As you know, I always like to pull my opacity sliders the whole way to the left and then slowly build those up to the right to just add just the amount of effect that I like back in the image. This is very important. Whenever you do any kind of blurring effects like this is something you never want to do, because look what happens. Like, look up to the top left-hand corner here. See how nasty that looks, that blurring right there? That looks horrible. So never pull your opacity sliders back whenever you do a blur adjustment. That's just a little tip. So keep that opacity the whole way up. I hope you liked the video today. If you did, please give it a like. And also, if you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do so. And click that notification bell so you can be notified of all the new training videos that I'm putting out on a regular basis. I put them out approximately every 1 to 3 days. Well, thanks again for joining me today, and I will see you guys next time.